Morning, everybody, and happy Easter. It's Father Dave from Most Holy Trinity Parish in Susquehanna County, PA. And today I just thought we'd get together and talk a little bit about a favorite author of mine, actually two authors. One, G.K. Chesterton, who was a very well-known Catholic convert from England, who was also an apologist and a art critic and a critic of literature. He was a well-known journalist, writing for 4 different newspapers, his own GK Weekly, his brother's newspaper, and he also the London Illustrated Times and the London Post. And he's also a novelist, so he's written over 100 books. He's written over 1,000 and some essays. He's well known for his poetry, and he's also a person who wrote some very interesting fiction and stories about 2 different detectives that we'll talk a little bit about. He's also very well known for being a person who was terrific in debate and also as a public speaker. And so, as a Catholic convert, a very interesting person. He had died back in 1936, and yet his books are still very well received. They're very timely, filled with humor, and very interesting. Some of his books, as a matter of fact, some of his detective stories have never been out of print since they were first written, so over 100 years. So another author that I will mention too is going to be Dale Alquist, who is a real expert on Chesterton, and he's also written some books, introductions to Chesterton, a biography. Here's a biography at Night of the Holy Ghost about G.K. Gilbert Keith Chesterton. And also, he calls him the Apostle of Common Sense, and you can see a picture of Chesterton there, or Common Sense 101, Lessons from G.K. Chesterton. Now, Chesterton was a very big guy, very tall and pretty heavy, and he was had a terrific sense of humor. Like, he was known to say that one time on the train, he got up so that 3 ladies could have his seat. So he didn't mind having a little jest poked at himself, even if it came from someone else. One time he was writing at home, and there was a house being built near his house, and there was a lot of noise from the construction, and he kind of asked one of the neighbors if they could talk to the foreman to let him know that they're making too much noise. And so the neighbor went over and yelled, "Hello, Mr. Chesterton can't write." And the foreman yelled back, "Yes, we know." And Chesterton really liked that story. He got a big kick out of it. But he started his career as an art student. And so he was studying art. He didn't go to a normal college, but he did that. Then he got an opportunity to write for newspaper, art criticism column, which went over very well. And he moved on to writing about many other people in literature. One very famous person would be Charles Dickens, who at that time was kind of, falling out of favor. A lot of people not really familiar with Dickens and his works until Chesterton wrote his book on Charles Dickens and really got a resurgence back of interest in Charles Dickens. As a matter of fact, he wrote 2 books on Dickens and many, many others on other authors. As a young guy, he started again getting into writing about politics and religion, and he very well got on his way to really getting deeper into the Christian faith, and he became friends with a priest at the time whose name was Father John O'Connor, who became the priest who helped Chesterton with instructions as he was getting ready to come in to the Catholic Church. And that priest, Father O'Connor, actually became the model for Chesterton's one of his most beloved characters in his fiction, which would be Father Brown. So here we have, you can see there are several volumes of these short stories, Father Brown of the Church of Rome, or The Scandal of Father Brown. Most of these are murder mysteries, and he was inspired by Father O'Connor because he went to talk to Father O'Connor about ethics and morals, and he found that Father O'Connor had a very extensive knowledge on all kinds of things that were happening in the world that had to do with sin. And he was kind of shocked because Chesterton himself didn't know some of the things that Father O'Connor did. And later on, they were visiting with some college students, university students, and they had a nice conversation. And Father O'Connor had to excuse himself, go do some other things. And the students say, well, we're impressed with his knowledge and understanding, but he probably doesn't know very much of the world. And GK got a real kick out of that, knowing that Father O'Connor knew a lot about what's going on in the world, especially someone spending his life hearing confessions. But he started writing these stories. You can also see them on video, a new series and an older one from the BBC, where Father Brown is this unlikely kind of detective who shows up on the scene of a murder and begins to detect, little by little, coming to solve the crime. And there's an interesting thing about him, a couple things. He's very unassuming, and so the killer and others don't think that he's any threat at discovering who the killer would be. He also isn't somebody who wants to catch them and bring them to justice. He just solves the crime. What he really wants to do is bring them to conversion. And as we go through the stories, we see him solve crime after crime. And one of the last stories that Chesterton wrote about Father Brown, he has a person interviewing Father Brown, asking him, how could you solve all of those murders? And Father Brown said, well, it's very simple. I killed all of those people. And what he meant by that was he would try to get into the heart and the mind of the killer to find the motive. And once he could understand the motive, he would be easily able to solve the problem. One of his best friends, who's also becomes kind of his sidekick, is a burglar named Flambeau. He's French, and he is one who, is at first a kind of a nemesis to Father Brown. Then he comes to conversion, and he actually joins with him in solving crimes. And in one of the stories, they come upon a body hanging in a tree with a sword through its heart. And Flambeau says, well, why would somebody put a sword through somebody who's already hanged? And Father Brown says, I was thinking the opposite. Why would they hang somebody that they already killed with a sword? And of course, then the story continues on with looking for the clues and finding the killer. But they're very enjoyable short stories and very interesting. So I would recommend those. You might want to start with the videos and then move on to the books. But we have many other things by Chesterton too. Some of the things he wrote very much on the faith. One would be called The Everlasting Man. You could get that on CD or also in the book form. And this book is about, one, the world of creation that God created, and two, the Christ. And so it gives us some real insights into the faith and different situations that we face in our life. An interesting thing about this book is that C.S. Lewis, another famous author, read it, and it helped him on his conversion to the Christian faith. And so Chesterton had some influence on some famous people. In one of his articles for a newspaper, Chesterton wrote an article on India, where he argued that the people of India should be living according to their ancient culture rather than a new culture that was imposed on them by another group. And a young lawyer who read that was Mahatma Gandhi, and he was encouraged to continue to form his movement that eventually did bring independence to India. So we have influence of Chesterton on somebody like C.S. Lewis and also Gandhi, and actually quite a few others. He wrote on many, many subjects. Life of the Saints, two of the saints that he wrote on, we could say be very different from Chesterton. Would be St. Francis, because Chesterton was a guy who smoked, and he liked to have a drink of ale. As a matter of fact, the mayor of his town appointed him. He was very well loved in his hometown, and the mayor appointed him as the official ale tester for the city. And the joke in the pubs was, how much ale is Chesterton entitled to taste? So he got a kick out of that too. But we take a look at his life as a writer. He was extremely gifted. So another person that he would be, I would compare him to a little bit, would be St. Thomas Aquinas. That's another biography that Chesterton wrote. And Aquinas was known to be able to dictate 3 separate books at the same time. Book A to scribe 1, Book B to scribe 2, and Book C to scribe 3. Chesterton could actually write an article while he was dictating a second article to his secretary. So quite a gift, similar to Aquinas. Another thing, a reporter came to his house one time because they wanted to interview Chesterton, and Chesterton was in the process of moving, and at the same time he was writing an article himself. And so he's sitting at a chair writing the article and also conducting the interview, and every once in a while he would have to move to another place in the room because the movers were taking the furniture out of the house. He finally ended up finishing his article on the mantelpiece, and when the interview was over, he put his own article into an envelope and asked the person who was interviewing him, the reporter, to please take this to the editor for print in the paper. So it's just a little bit about Chesterton, and we're going to get back to that another time, probably next week, to talk about a few other things about him, and maybe we'll move on to a couple of other authors who you may or may not be familiar with, but maybe during these days when we're sheltering in place, you might be inspired to take maybe one of Chesterton's books or Dale Alquist and enjoy the wisdom and the wit and just the insight into the faith that we get from these two very excellent authors. So God bless, and you have a good day.